Chapter 30 of Historical Tales, Volume 6, French, by Charles Morris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 30 The Burning of Moscow. From west to east across Europe had marched the army of the great conqueror, no nation daring to draw a hostile sword, none venturing to place an obstacle in its path. Across Russia it had marched almost as triumphantly, breaking irresistibly through the dams of armed men in its way, sweeping onward with the strength and majesty of fate. At length it had reached the heart of the empire of the Tsars, and before it lay displayed the ancient capital of the Muscovite kings, time-honoured Moscow. This great city was revealed to the eyes of the weary soldiers with the suddenness of a mirage in the desert. Throughout that day an interminable outreach of level country had seemed to spread before them, dreary, uninviting, disheartening. Now, from the summit of the hill, their triumphant eyes gazed suddenly upon the roofs and spires of a mighty city, splendid, far-reaching, stretching far across the plain that lay revealed before their eyes. It seemed to them truly as if the hand of a magician had touched the desert and caused this city to spring up across their path. It was a remarkable spectacle that met their gaze. Here were visible what seemed like hundreds of gilded domes and shining spires, thousands of habitations rich with varied colours, a strange compound of palaces and cottages, churches and bell-towers, woods and lakes, Western and Oriental architecture, the Gothic arches and spires of Europe mingled with the strange forms of Byzantine and Asiatic edifices. Outwardly, a line of monasteries flanked with towers appeared to encircle the city. Centrally, crowning an eminence, rose a great citadel, from whose towers one could look down on columned temples and imperial palaces, embattled walls crowned with majestic domes, from whose summits, above the reversed crescent, rose the cross, Russia's emblem of conquest over the fanatical sectaries of the East. It was the Kremlin which they here beheld, the sacred centre of the Russian Empire, the ancient dwelling-place and citadel of the Tsars. A wild cry of wonder and triumph burst from the soldiers who had first reached the summit of the hill. "Moscow! Moscow!" they shouted, their imaginations strongly excited by the magnificent spectacle. This cry lent wings to those behind them. In crowding hosts the eager soldiers rushed up the long slope, all ranks mingling in their burning desire to gaze upon that great city which was the goal of their far-extended march. Deep were the emotions, intense the joy, with which they gazed on this dazzling vision, with all its domes and spires burning in the warm rays of the sun. Napoleon himself, who hastened to the spot, was struck with admiration, and new dreams of glory, doubtless, sprang up in his soul as he stood gazing with deep emotion on what must have seemed to him the key of the East, the gateway to conquests never yet surpassed by man. Little did he dream that it was ruin upon which he gazed, the fatal turning-point in his long career of victory. Still certain of his genius, still confident in his good fortune, he looked forward to new conquests which would throw those of the past into the shade, and as his eyes rested on that mighty city of the Tsars, the intoxication of glory filled his soul. The conqueror gave but little time to those dreams. The steps to realize them must be taken. Murat was bidden to march forward quickly and to repress all disorders which might break out in the city. Denier was ordered to hasten and arrange for the food and lodging of the soldiers. Duresnel received orders to communicate with the authorities, to calm their fears, and to lead them to the conqueror, that he might receive their homage. Fancying that the inhabitants awaited his coming in trembling fear, Napoleon halted until these preliminaries should be arranged, before making his triumphant entry into the conquered capital of Muscovy. Murat, at the head of the light cavalry, galloped rapidly forward, quickly reaching the bridge over the Moskova. Here he found a rear guard of the Russian army in rapid retreat. The meeting was not a hostile one. Murat rode to the Russian line and asked if there was an officer among them who spoke French. A young Russian immediately presented himself and asked him what he wanted. "Who is the commander of this rear guard?" he asked. The Russian pointed to a white-haired officer who wore a long cloak of fur. Murat advanced and held out his hand. The officer took and pressed it warmly. "Do you know me?" asked the Frenchman. "Yes," answered the Russian courteously. "We have seen enough of you under fire to know you." A short colloquy succeeded, during which Murat could not keep his eyes from the officer's fur cloak, which looked as if it would be very comfortable in a winter bivouac. The Russian, noticing his looks, took off the mantle and offered it to him, begging him to accept it as a present from an admiring foe. Marat courteously accepted it, and in return presented the officer with a beautiful and valuable watch, which was accepted in the same spirit of courteous goodwill. The Russian officer now joined his men, who were filing rapidly away, and Marat rode onward into the streets of the captured city, his staff and a detachment of cavalry accompanying him. Through street after street he passed, here finding himself moving between rows of narrow wooden houses, there through avenues bordered by palatial residences, which rose from rich and ample gardens, but all silent and seemingly deserted. The city was there, but where were the people? Solitude surrounded him. Not an inhabitant was to be seen. It seemed a city of the dead. Into Berlin, Vienna, and other capitals had the French army entered, but never had it seen anything like this utter solitude. The inhabitants, so the surprised soldiers fancied, must be cowering in terror within their houses. This desolation could not continue. Moscow was known as one of the most bustling cities in Europe. As soon as the people learned that no harm was meant them, the streets would again swarm with busy life. Hugging this flattering opinion to his soul, Marat rode on, threading the silent city. Ah, here were some of the people. A few distracted individuals had appeared in the streets. Marat rode up to them to find that they were French, belonging to the foreign colony of Moscow. They begged piteously for protection from the robbers, who they said had become masters of the town. They told Marat more than this, destroying the pleasant picture of a submissive and contented population with which he had solaced his mind. The population had fled, they said. No one was left in the city except a few strangers and some Russians who knew the ways of the French and did not fear them. In their place was a crew of thieves and bandits, whom the Count of Rostopchin had let loose on deserted Moscow, emptying the prisons and setting these convicts free to ravage the city at their will. Further evidence of this disheartening story was soon forthcoming. When the French approached the Kremlin, they were saluted by a discharge of musketry. Some of the villainous crew had invaded the capital, seized on the guns in the arsenal, and were firing on the invaders. A few minutes settled this last effort in the defense of Moscow. The citadel was entered at a charge. Several of the villainous crew were sabred, and the others put to flight. The French had the town, but it was an empty one, its only inmates being thieves and strangers. The next morning, September 15th, 1812, Napoleon made his triumphal march into Moscow at the head of his conquering legions. But for the first time in his career of victory he found himself in the streets of a deserted city, advancing through empty avenues, to whose windows the tread of marching feet called not an eye to witness the triumph of France. It was a gloomy and threatening impression which was experienced by the Grand Army in its progress through those silent and lifeless streets. The ancient city of the Czars seemed a body without a soul. But if the people were gone, their dwellings remained. Moscow was taken, with all its palaces and treasures. It was a signal conquest. Napoleon hastened to the Kremlin, mounted to the top of the lofty Tower of Ivan, and from its height looked with eyes of pride on the far-extending city. It was grand, that vision of palatial mansions, but it was mournful in its silence and gloom, the tramp of soldiery its only sound, the flutter of multitudes of birds, ravens and crows which haunted the city in thousands, its only sign of life. 2 days before, Moscow had been one of the busiest cities in the world. Now it was the most silent. But the conqueror had this satisfaction, that while abandoned, like other Russian towns, it was not burned like them. He might find here winter quarters for his army, and by mild measures lure the frightened people back to their homes again. Comforted with this hopeful view, Napoleon descended the stairs again, filled with confidence and triumph. His confidence was misplaced. Disaster lowered upon the devoted city. On the day succeeding his entrance, a column of flame suddenly appeared, rising from a large building in which was stored an abundant supply of spirits. The soldiers ran thither without thought of alarm, fancying that this was due to some imprudence on the part of their own men. In a short time the fire was mastered, and a feeling of confidence returned. But immediately afterwards a new fire broke out in a great collection of buildings called the Bazaar, in which were the richest shops of the city, filled with costly goods, the beautiful fabrics of Persia and India, and rare and precious commodities from all quarters of the world. Here the flames spread with extraordinary rapidity, consuming the inflammable goods with frightful haste, despite the frantic efforts of the soldiers to arrest their progress. Despairing of success, they strove to save something from the vast riches of the establishment, carrying out furs, costly wines, valuable tissues, and other precious treasures. Such as remained of the people of the town aided in these efforts, in the natural desire to save something from the flames. Until now, all this seemed ordinary accident, and no one dreamed that these fires were the result of hostile design. they were soon to learn more of the unconquerable determination of the Russians. During the following night the wind rose suddenly and carried the flames of the burning bazaar along several of the most beautiful streets of Moscow, the fire spreading rapidly among the wooden buildings, and consuming them with alarming rapidity. But this was not the most disturbing indication. Rockets were seen in the distance, ascending into the air, and immediately afterwards fire broke out in a dozen quarters, and hired bandits were seen carrying combustibles at the end of long poles, and seeking to extend the empire of the flames. A number of these were arrested, and under threat of death revealed a frightful secret. The Count of Rostopchín had ordered that the great city of Moscow should be set on fire and burned, with as little heed for the immense loss involved as he would have had in ordering the burning of a wayside village. The news filled the whole army with consternation. Waiting till the wind had risen, the ferocious Count had sent up his signal rockets to order the work to begin. He had done more. On running to the pumps to obtain water to extinguish the flames, there were none to be found. They had been removed, and the fire-extinguishing apparatus destroyed in preparation for this incendiary work. Napoleon, alarmed and incensed, ordered that all caught in the act of firing buildings should be executed on the spot. The army was directed to use every effort to extinguish the flames, but the high wind set all their efforts at defiance. It increased in fury and varied in direction, carrying the conflagration over new quarters. From the Kremlin could be seen vast columns of fire shooting from building to building, wrapping the wooden structures in lurid sheets of flame, sweeping destruction forward at frightful speed. The roar of the flames, the explosions that from time to time took place, the burning fragments which filled the air, borne on the wings of the wind, all went to make a scene as grand and fearful as human eye has ever gazed upon. To Napoleon and his men, who saw their hopes of safe and pleasant winter quarters thus vanishing in flame, it must have been a most alarming and disquieting spectacle. After blowing for some hours from the northwest, the wind shifted to the southwest, and the conflagration invaded new regions of the city. The Kremlin, hitherto out of the range of the flames, was now in danger. Fiery sparks, borne by the wind, fell on its roof and in its courtyard. The most frightful danger of the whole night now threatened the imperiled army. In the courtyards of the Kremlin had been placed more than 400 wagons of ammunition. In its arsenal were 100,000 pounds of powder. Should the flames reach these, Napoleon and his guards would be blown into the air. All who were near him pressed him to hasten from this imminent peril. General Lariboisière begged them to fly, as a duty which he owed to his army. Officers who came in from the streets reported that it was almost impossible to pass through the avenues of the town, and that delay would increase the danger. To remain where they were much longer might render escape impossible. Napoleon, convinced by these words, left the Kremlin, after some 24 hours' possession of this old palace of the Tsars, and descended to the quay of the Moskva, where he found his horses awaiting him. Mounting, he rode through the fire-invaded streets towards the northwest, but with no little difficulty and danger, for the flames from the other quarters of the city were now spreading here. The wind seemed steadily to increase in violence. Torrents of smoke, cinders, and sparks were driven down into the streets. Sheets of flame seemed to bend downward, as if to sweep the ground. On every side the troops were flying for their lives. On every side the conflagration pursued them. It was through imminent peril that the grand army, which on the morning before had marched so triumphantly into that abandoned city, now succeeded in gaining a safe location outside, whence they could look back in despair on that hell of flames in which their dearest hopes were being consumed. A small number of the inhabitants who had remained concealed in their houses now came out, carrying away with them what treasures they most esteemed. In some cases, women their children, men their aged parents, many of them barely saving their clothes, and disputing the possession of even these with the band of robbers whom Rostopchín had let loose, and who, like spirits of evil, danced with glee in the midst of the terrible conflagration which had been kindled by their hands. So ended one of the most startling events in history, the burning of a great city to dispossess a victorious foe. It proved successful. When Napoleon left the Kremlin on that fearful night, he began his downward career. The conflagration, it is true, did not drive him at once from Moscow. He lingered for more than a month amid its ruins, in the vain hope that the Tsar would ask him for terms of peace. But the Tsar kept silent. The city was untenable for winter quarters, and retreat became imperative. When at length the grand army marched, winter marched with it, a winter such as even Russia had rarely seen. Napoleon had delayed too long. The North gathered its forces and swooped upon its shivering ranks, with death in its blasts. The Russians, recovering from their losses, rushed upon his freezing columns, pouring destruction upon them as they marched. All was at an end. The great victor's tide of success had definitely turned. He had entered Russia with nearly 500,000 men. Hardly a tenth part of this great army followed him from that fatal land. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of Historical Tales, Volume 6, French, by Charles Morris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 31. Napoleon's Return from Elba. All was quiet in Elba. Nothing was talked of at Porto Ferrajo but the ball to be given by Pauline, the sister of Napoleon, who had exchanged his imperial dominion over half Europe for kingship over that little Mediterranean island. Evening came. The fête was a brilliant one. Napoleon was present, gay, cheerful, easy, to all appearance fully satisfied with his little kingdom, and without thought of wider empire or heavier cares. He stayed till a late hour, and went home with two of his old generals, Bertrand and Drouet, to tell them the news which had come to him from the Continent. The news was not altogether to his liking. The Congress at Vienna had decreed his transportation to the Azores. Elba was too near France. Such was the state of affairs on the night of February 25th, 1815. At sunset of the next day there might have been seen a small flotilla moving before a south wind along the shores of Elba. It consisted of a brig, the Inconstant by name, a schooner, and 5 smaller vessels. The brig evidently carried guns. The decks of the other vessels were crowded with men in uniform. On the deck of the Inconstant stood Napoleon, his face filled with hope and joy, his hand waving an adieu to his sister Pauline, who watched him from the chateau windows on the island shore. The next day came. The sea was motionless. Not a breath of wind could be felt. The island was still close at hand. At a distance might be seen the French and English cruisers which guarded that side of the island, now moveless upon a moveless sea. It was doubtful if the flotilla had not better return, but the wind rose again, and their progress was resumed. 4 in the afternoon found them off the heights of Leghorn. 5 leagues to leeward lay one frigate, near the shores of Corsica was another. To windward could be seen a third, making its way towards the flotilla. It was the Zephyr of the French navy, commanded by Captain Andrieux. Now had come a vital moment in the enterprise. Should the Emperor declare himself, and seek to gain over Andrieux? It was too dangerous a venture. He bade the grenadiers on the deck to conceal themselves. It was a situation in which strategy seemed better than boldness. At 6 the 2 vessels were close together. Lieutenant Taillade of the Inconstant knew and saluted Captain Andrieux. A speaking trumpet colloquy followed. "Where are you bound?" asked Taillade. "To Leghorn, and you?" "To Genoa. Have you any commissions I can execute there?" "Thanks, not any. How is the Emperor?" "Very well. So much the better." The 2 vessels moved on, and soon lost sight of each other in the growing darkness. The other frigates had disappeared. The next day dawned. There was visible a large frigate in the distance, but it was not moving towards the flotilla. No danger was to be feared from this source. But the vessel's head had been turned to the southward, to Taillad's surprise. "Gentlemen," he called to the officers on the bridge, "are we bound for Spain or for Africa?" Napoleon, who had perceived the same thing, summoned Taillade from his conference with the officers. "Where are we?" he asked. "Sire, we are headed for Africa." "I don't wish to go there. Take me to France." "Your Majesty shall be there before noon tomorrow." The face of Napoleon beamed on hearing these words. He turned to the soldiers of the Old Guard who accompanied him, and said, "Yes, grenadiers, we are going to France, to Paris." Enthusiastic vivas followed his announcement, which told a tale of future glory to those war-hardened veterans. They had fought for the Emperor on many a mighty field. They were ready to dare new dangers in the hope of new triumphs. On the morning of Wednesday, March 1st, the shores of France were visible from the vessel's deck. At 3 in the afternoon anchor was dropped in the Bay of Juan. Cheers and salvos of artillery greeted those welcome shores, the boats were quickly dropped, and by 5 o'clock the whole expedition was on shore. The soldiers made their bivouac in an olive grove on the borders of the bay. "Happy omens," said Napoleon. "The olive is the emblem of peace." He plucked some violets, and then sat down and consulted his maps, which were spread on a table before him. There were 2 routes which might be taken, an easy one through Provence, and a difficult one over the snowy mountains of Dauphiné. But on the former he could not count on the loyalty of the people, on the latter he could. The difficult route was chosen. It proved a cold and wearying journey. The men were obliged to march in single file along narrow roads which bordered precipices. Several mules, one of them laden with gold, lost their footing and were plunged down the cliff. Napoleon was forced to dismount and go on foot to keep warm. For a short time he rested beside the brushwood fire of a cabin whose only tenant was an old woman. "Have you any news from Paris?" he asked her. "Do you know what the king is doing?" "The king? You mean the emperor," answered the old woman. "He is always down yonder." So here was a Frenchwoman who had not heard a word of the last year's doings. Was this the stuff of glory? Napoleon looked at General Drouet and said in pensive tones, "Do you hear this, Drouet? What, after all, is the good of troubling the world in order to fill it with our name?" We cannot follow their progress step by step. That small army of 1,000 men was marching to conquer a kingdom, but for days it had only the mountains and the snows to overcome. As yet not a soldier had been encountered, and they had been a week on shore. But the news of the landing had now spread far and wide, and soldiers were marching to stop the advance of the Brigand of Elba, as the Royalists in Paris called Napoleon. How would they receive him, with volleys or acclamations? That was soon to be learned. The troops in that part of France were concentrated at Grenoble and its vicinity. The Emperor was approaching them. The problem would soon be solved. At 9 o'clock of March 7th, Napoleon separated his small force into 3 divisions, himself taking station in the midst of the advance guard on horseback, wearing his famous grey overcoat and the broad ribbon of the Legion of Honour. About 1 o'clock the small battalion approached a regiment of the troops of the king, who were drawn up in a line across the road. Napoleon dismounted. "Colonel Maillet," he said, "tell the soldiers to put their weapons under their left arms, points down." "Sire," said the colonel, "is it not dangerous to act thus in presence of troops whose sentiments we do not know, and whose first fire may be so fatal?" "Maillet, tell them to put the weapons under their arms," repeated Napoleon. The order was obeyed. The 2 battalions faced each other, at short pistol shot, in absolute silence. Napoleon advanced alone towards the royal troops. "Present arms," he commanded. They obeyed, levelling their guns at their old commander. He advanced slowly with impassive face. Reaching their front, he touched his cap and saluted. "Soldiers of the 5th," he cried loudly, "do you recognize me?" "Yes, yes," came from some voices, filled with barely repressed enthusiasm. "Soldiers, behold your general, behold your emperor," he continued. "Let any of you who wishes to kill him, fire." Fire? Their guns went to the earth. They flung themselves on their knees before him, called him father, shed tears, shouted as if in frenzy, waved their shakos on their bayonets and sabres. "All is over," said Napoleon to Bertrand and Drouet. "In 10 days we shall be in the Tuileries." In a brief time the Emperor moved on, the King's regiment, now wearing the tricolour cockade, following with his former troop. As they drew near Grenoble, throngs of peasantry gathered with enthusiastic cheers. Another regiment approached, the 7th of the line, commanded by Colonel de Labédoyère. He had taken the eagle of the regiment from a chest, brandished his sword, and crying, "Long live the Emperor! Those who love, follow me!" led the way from Grenoble. The whole regiment followed. Meeting Napoleon, the colonel and the Emperor sprang from their horses and warmly embraced. "Colonel," said Napoleon, "it is you who will replace me on the throne." It was night when they reached Grenoble. The Royalist authorities had closed the gates, but the ramparts were thronged with men. The darkness was profound, but Labédoyère called out loudly, "Soldiers, it is I, Labédoyère, colonel of the 7th. We bring you Napoleon. He is yonder. It is for you to receive him, and to repeat with us the rallying cry of the former conquerors of Europe, 'Live the Emperor!'" His words were followed by a ringing shout from the ramparts. Many ran to the gates. Finding them closed and barred, they furiously attacked them with axes, while the peasants outside hammered on them as fiercely. Thus doubly assailed, they soon gave way, and the stream of newcomers rushed in, torches and flambeaux illuminating the scene. Napoleon had no little difficulty in making his way through the crowd, which was delirious with joy, and reaching an inn, the Three Dauphins, where he designed to pass the night. On the 9th he left Grenoble, followed by 6,000 of his old soldiers. His march was an ovation. He reached Lyons on the 10th. Several regiments had been collected here to oppose him, but they all trampled the white cockade of the king underfoot, assumed the tricolour, and fraternized with the Emperor's troops. Marshal Ney was the only hope left to the Royalists. He had, they said, promised Louis XVIII to bring back Napoleon in an iron cage. This hope vanished when Ney issued a proclamation beginning, "The cause of the Bourbons is lost for ever," which was followed on March 18th by his embracing the Emperor openly at Auxerre. All was over for Louis XVIII. Near midnight of March 19th, some travelling carriages rolled away from the courtyard of the Tuileries in a torrent of rain, and amid a furious windstorm that extinguished the carriage lights. It was Louis XVIII. Going into exile. On the 20th, at 9 o'clock in the evening, the Emperor Napoleon drove through the streets of Paris towards the abandoned palace, through hosts of shouting soldiers and a population that was wild with joy. The officers tore him from his carriage and carried him on their arms, kissing his hands, embracing his old grey overcoat, not letting his feet touch ground till they had borne him to the foot of the grand stairway of the Tuileries. It was 20 days since he had landed, and France was his, the people, the soldiers alike, mad with delight, none, to all appearance, dreaming of what renewed miseries this ill-omened return of their worshipped emperor meant. It meant, as we now know, bloodshed, slaughter, and ruin. It meant Waterloo and St. Helena. It meant 100 days of renewed empire, and then the final end of the power of the great conqueror. On August 7th, less than 5 months from the date of the triumphant entry into the Tuileries, Napoleon stepped on board the British frigate Northumberland, to be borne to the far-off isle of St. Helena, his future home. 25 years after the date of these events, Napoleon returned again to France, but under very different auspices from those described. On the 29th of November, 1840, there anchored at Cherbourg, amid the salutes of forts and ships, a French war vessel called the Belle Poule, on which were the mortal remains of the great conqueror, long since conquered by death, and now brought back to the land over which he had so long reigned. On December 8th, the coffin was transferred to the steamer Normandie, amid a salute of 2,000 guns, and taken by it to the Seine. On December 15th, the coffin, placed on a splendid car drawn by 16 horses, moved in solemn procession through the streets of Paris, attended by the noblest escort the city could provide, and passing through avenues thronged with adoring multitudes, who forgot the injuries the great soldier had done to France, and remembered only his fame. The funeral train was received by King Louis Philippe, the royal family, and all the high dignitaries of the government at the church of the Invalides, in which a noble and worthy final resting-place had been prepared for the corpse of the once mighty emperor. Napoleon, says Bourrienne, had again and finally conquered. While every throne in Europe was shaking, the great conqueror came to claim and receive from posterity the crown for which he had sacrificed so much. In the Invalides, the emperor had at last found a resting-place by the banks of the Seine among the French people whom he had loved so well. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of Historical Tales, Volume 6, French, by Charles Morris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 32, The Prussian War and the Paris Commune. There have been 2 critical periods in the story of France in which history was made at a rate of rapidity rarely equalled in the history of the world. The first of these was the era of the Revolution and the Napoleonic regime, which has no parallel among human events in the rapidity and momentous gravity of its changes. The second was the period from August 1870 to the summer of 1871, less than a year in length, yet crowded with important events to an unprecedented degree. Within that year was fought a great war between France and Germany, in which the military power of France, in an incredibly brief period, was utterly overthrown, and that nation left at the mercy of its opponent. Within the same period, the Second Empire of France came to a sudden and disastrous end, and a republic, the third in French history, was built upon its ruins. Simultaneously, a new and powerful empire was founded, that of Germany, the palace at Versailles being the scene of this highly important change in the political conditions of Europe. During this period also a political revolution took place in Italy, in consequence of the French war, and Paris sustained 2 sieges, the first by the German army, the second, and most bitter, by the French themselves, fighting against a mob of fanatical revolutionists and ending in a frightful saturnalia of murder, ruin, and revenge. Has there ever been a year in the world's history more crowded with momentous events? Within that year the political status of France, Germany, and Italy was transformed. The late Emperor of France suddenly found himself a throneless fugitive, and the people of Paris passed through an experience unparalleled in the diversified history of that ancient city. Of all the sieges to which Paris had been subjected, far the strangest was that in which the scum of the city, miscalled the Commune, fought with tiger-like ferocity against the forces of the newly formed republic, filled with the revengeful and murderous spirit which had inspired the masses in the first revolution. It is the story of this tragic interlude which we propose here to tell, premising with a brief resume of the events which led up to it. Louis Napoleon, posing as Emperor Napoleon III of France, a position which he had been able to gain through the glamour of the name of his famous uncle, was infected through his reign with the desire to emulate the deeds of the great Napoleon. He hoped to shine as one of the military stars of Europe, and was encouraged by the success of the war which he fomented in Italy. His second effort in this direction was the invasion of Mexico and the attempt to establish an empire under his tutelage upon American soil. In this he ran counter to the Monroe Doctrine and the power of the United States, and was forced to retire with his feathers scorched and his prestige sadly diminished. But what he probably proposed to make the great military triumph of his reign came in 1870, when, on a flimsy pretense, a misunderstanding which called only for diplomatic adjustment, he suddenly declared war against Germany, and rashly put his armies into the field to cope with that powerful rival. Never had there been a more unwise or suicidal proceeding. In shameful ignorance of the real condition of the army, which he was made to believe was 5 times ready, ready to the last gaiter button, he marshalled against the thoroughly prepared military power of Germany an army ill organized, ill supplied, without proper reserves, and led by commanders of appalling incapacity. Maps and plans were bad, strategy was an unknown quantity, no study had been made of the use of the railway in war, almost everything except courage was lacking. And courage without leadership was hopeless against the thoroughly drilled and supplied German army and the science of Jan Moltke, the great German strategist. Had it been the first Napoleon, he would have made himself sure personally as to the last gaiter button and all other details. But with sublime self-satisfaction and inane blindness, the second Napoleon put himself at the head of this unready army, inspired apparently with the "on to Berlin" confidence of the cheering Parisian mob. He was to be awakened suddenly and painfully from his dream of victory and military fame. The first collision of the two armies took place on August 2nd. On September 2nd, just 1 month later, the derelict emperor was a prisoner of war in the hands of the King of Prussia, together with his army of more than 80,000 men. He had proved an utter failure as a commander, a mere encumbrance, without a plan of campaign, a conception of leadership, or an idea of strategic movements. Recognizing when too late his incapacity, he had resigned the general command to Marshal Bazaine, who withdrew with a large army into Metz, and subsequently, in a northward movement for Bazaine's relief, he found himself surrounded at Sedan by an irresistible force, and was obliged to surrender to save his army from impending annihilation. Such was the first act in this lugubrious drama. 2 days later, on September 4th, France was proclaimed a republic. Before the end of October, Bazaine surrendered Metz to the Germans, and his great army of 180,000 men was lost to France. The military force of France was vanishing with alarming rapidity. Another event of the period, of interest in this connection, was the loss of the temporal power of the Pope, above alluded to. The papacy had been defended by Napoleon III against the Italian revolutionists, and the withdrawal of the French force from Rome left that city open to the army of Victor Emmanuel. It was occupied in September, and became the capital of the new kingdom of Italy. In December another important event took place, the King of Prussia being proclaimed at Versailles the head of a new empire of Germany, which embraced all the German states except Austria. Events of great moment, as it may be seen, were occurring with startling rapidity. Before the surrender of Bazaine, the advance of the German army had appeared before Paris, and on September 19th the siege of that city began. Soon it was so closely invested that food could not enter, and the only way out was by balloon. The German bombardment did little damage to the great city, which was defended obstinately, but the Germans had a powerful ally within, where the grisly demon of famine threatened the defenders. Meanwhile, Gambetta, the most ardent patriot left to France, was seeking with nervous energy to raise fresh armies in the south. Garibaldi, his sword free from duty in Italy, had come to the aid of France. All patriots were called to the ranks, and a struggle of some importance took place. But all this practically ceased on the 28th of January, 1871, when an armistice brought the hopeless resistance of Paris to an end. Almost at once the war died out on all sides, the Germans occupied all the forts around Paris, and France lay at the mercy of Germany after a struggle of 6 months' duration. The first siege of Paris had terminated, a second and more desperately contested one was at hand. On March 13th the German army surrounded Paris, which had been given the triumph of a march into the conquered city, set out on its return home, and the authorities of the new republic prepared to take possession of their freed capital. They were to find the task one of unlooked-for difficulty. On March 18th the revolutionary element of the city rose en masse, organized under the name of the Commune, took possession of Paris, and prepared to defend it to the death against the leaders of the new-formed government, who they condemned as aristocrats. The story of the Commune is a shameful and terrible one. Being in a fraternization of the National Guard with the mob, its advent was sealed with murder. In a contest on the 18th for the possession of some cannon, General Lecomte ordered his men to fire on the insurgents. They refused. A gentleman standing in a crowd of angry men on the street corner said, "General Lecomte is right." He was immediately seized and quickly recognized as General Clément Thomas, a brave officer who had done gallant service during the siege. This sufficed him nothing with the mob. He and General Lecomte were at once dragged away to prison. At 4 o'clock that same day they were brought out by a party of the insurgent National Guards, and after a mock trial were taken to a walled enclosure and shot down in cold blood. They were the first victims of the mob, which had early begun to burn its bridges behind it. On the following day the leaders of the outbreak met at the Hôtel de Ville. They all belonged to the Internationale, a secret society formed for the abolition of property, religion, rulers, government, and the upper classes, and the reduction of the community to a state of anarchy, or something resembling it. They called upon the citizens to meet in their sections and elect a commune, the new form of government advocated by the anarchists, in which destruction of all existing institutions was to precede reconstruction from the bottom upwards. Events now moved rapidly. A delegation from the few men of note left in Paris proceeded to Versailles, where the government of the Republic was in session, and demanded that special municipal rights should be given to the people of Paris. The refusal of this request precipitated the insurrection. The furious people at once elected a revolutionary government, choosing the most extreme of the revolutionists, who organized what was called the Council of the Commune. This consisted of 80 members of varied nationality, 70 of them never having been heard of in Paris before. They had risen from the bottom of the deep sea of anarchy to assume control. On the 3rd of April the Civil War broke out, Paris against Versailles, the army under the Assembly of the Republic against the National Guard in sympathy with the Commune. The Germans, who still held 2 of the forts in the vicinity of Paris, looked grimly on at the tragedy about to be played upon the stage which their hands had erected. The war began with murder. Dr. Pasquier, a distinguished surgeon, bearing a flag of truce, met 2 National Guards on the bridge of Courbevoie, near Neuilly, where the body of Napoleon had been brought ashore 30 years before. After a brief debate, one of the soldiers ended the colloquy by blowing out the doctor's brains. As soon as General Vinoy, in command of the Army of Order, heard of this murderous act, he ordered the guns of Fort Varélien to be turned upon the city. On the following morning 5 columns of the troops of the Commune marched out to take the fort, lured by the confident impression that the soldiers under Vinoy would fraternize with them. They were mistaken. The guns of Fort Varélien hurled death-dealing missiles into their columns, and they were quickly in full retreat. Fleurance, a scientist of fame who had joined their ranks, fell dead. Duval, one of their generals, was captured and was quickly shot as a traitor. The other leaders were at once sent to prison by the angry council on their return, and the Commune ordered that Paris should be filled with barricades. Though the Commune had imprisoned the unsuccessful generals, they were infuriated at the execution of Generals Duval, and sought in the dignitaries of the Church the most exalted hostages they could find against such summary acts. On the night of the 6th, Monseigneur d'Arbois, Archbishop of Paris, his chaplain, and 8 other priests were arrested. The curé of the Madeleine and his vicar had before been seized. Other priests were later taken into custody, and the prison at Mazas was well filled with these so-called hostages. The fury of the leaders of the revolt led them to other excesses against religion, the churches being closed, the arms cut from the crosses, and red flags hung in their stead. The outrages were not confined to the church. In the words of a resident of Paris, the motto of the Commune soon became fraternity of that sort which means arrest of each other. Before the council was 2 weeks old, many of its leading members had found their way to prison. Dissensions had broken out in its midst, and the stronger victimized the weaker. By April 7th, a personage calling himself General Cluseret had, as someone expressed it, swallowed up the Commune. He called himself an American, and had been in the Union service in the American Civil War, but no one knew where he was born. He had served in the Chasseurs d'Afrique and in the Papal Zouaves, and after the fall of the Commune escaped from Paris and became a general of the Fenians, nearly capturing Chester Castle in their service. This man became absolute dictator over the revolted city with its 2,000,000 of inhabitants. Yet, after 3 weeks of this dictatorial rule, his star declined, and he found himself imprisoned at Mazas, to which he had sent so many others. Leaving these details for the present, we must return to the war, which was soon in full blast. The assault of April 4th repulsed, the guns of Fort Varélien were opened upon the city, and the second bombardment of Paris in that memorable year began. The guns of its friends were more destructive than those of its foes, the forts taking part in the bombardment being much nearer the centre of the city. Their shells damaged the Arch of Triumph, which the Prussians had spared. They fell alike on homes, public buildings, and churches, alike on men, women, and children, friend and foe. Under order of General Cluseret, the dictator of the Commune, every man was ordered to take part in the defence of the city. His neighbours were required to see that he did so, and to arrest him if he showed a disposition to decline. For the 73 days that the power of the Commune lasted, Paris was a veritable pandemonium, the fighting, the arrests, the bombardment keeping the excitement at an intense pitch. The people deserted the streets, which were silent and empty except for the soldiers of the Commune, a disorderly crew in motley uniforms, the movement of ammunition wagons, and the other scenes incident to a state of war. But the usual swarming life of Paris had vanished. There was no movement, scarcely any sound. The shop windows were shut, many of them boarded up, red flags hanging from a few, but as a rule the very buildings seemed dead. This is the story told by one observer, but another, perhaps at a different period of bombardment, speaks of well-dressed people loitering in the boulevards as if nothing were going on. The cafés, indeed, were ordered to close their doors at midnight, but behind closed shutters went on gambling, drinking, and debauchery. After spending a riotous night, fast men and women considered it a joke to drive out to the Arch of Triumph and see how the fight was going on. On the 9th of April, the army of Versailles began to make active assaults upon the forts held by the soldiers of the Commune, and with such effect that confusion and dismay quickly pervaded its councils. As the struggle went on, the fury and spirit of retaliation of the insurgents increased. New hostages were arrested, the palace of the Archbishop was pillaged, and in the first week of May the destruction of the house of M. Thiers, the President of the Republic, was decreed. It was a beautiful mansion, filled with objects of art and valuable documents used by him in writing his historical works. Some of these were removed, but most of them were consumed by the flames. On the 12th of May the Commune, now inspired by the spirit of destruction, ordered the levelling of the famous column in the Place Vendôme, describing it as a symbol of brute force and false glory. This famous column, 135 feet high, formed on the model of Trajan's column at Rome, had been erected by Napoleon I, cast from cannon taken from his foes, and surmounted by a statue of Napoleon in his imperial robes. On May 16th this proud work of art fell, being pulled down with a tremendous crash by the aid of ropes fastened to its upper part. It is pleasant to be able to state that this fine work of art has been restored. Its attempted destruction filled the army of Versailles with a spirit of revenge, which led them, on their entering Paris a few days later, to deal with the insurrectionists with brutal and merciless energy. They had other and abundant cause for this feeling, as the reader will perceive, in the recital of the later deeds of the desperate Commune. By the date now reached, the army of order was rapidly gaining ground. The fort of Vauves was taken, that of Montrouge was dismantled, breaches were opening in the barricades, and by the 20th of May the army was in the streets and fighting its way onward against a desperate defence. The carnage was frightful. Dambrovsky, a Pole and the only able general of the Commune, was killed. Prisoners on both sides were shot down without mercy. There were barricades in almost every street, and these were hotly defended, the courage of despair in their defenders making the progress of the besieging army a slow and bloody one. The rest of the story is all blood and horror. The desperate leaders of the Commune determined that if they must perish, Paris should be their funeral pyre. On the night of May the 24th, the city became a scene of incendiary rage. The Hôtel de Ville was in flames, the palace of the Tuileries was burning like a great furnace, the palace of the Legion of Honor, the Ministry of War, the Treasury, were lurid volcanoes of flames. On all sides the torch had been applied. Not only these great public buildings, but many private houses were consigned to flames. All the sewers beneath Paris had been strewn with torpedoes, bombs, and inflammable materials, connected with electric wires, and the catacombs in the eastern quarter of the city were similarly prepared. It was the intention of the desperate revolutionists to blow up the city, but fortunately, before their preparations were completed, the army of order was in control, and sappers and miners were sent underground to cut the electric wires leading to those mines of death-dealing explosives. But the capture of the city came too late to save the lives of many of the hostages whom the Commune had sent to prison. Not content with burning the architectural monuments of the city, as the last effort of baffled rage they condemned these innocent victims of their wrath to death. On Wednesday, May 24th, the venerable archbishop and 5 others of the imprisoned priests were taken from their cells and shot to death. On Thursday, 50 more, priests and others, were similarly slaughtered. A large number of captives remained shut up in the prison of La Roquette, around which, on Saturday the 27th, a yelling crowd gathered, thirsting for their lives. They, knowing that their rescuers were fighting within the city, determined to defend themselves and convert the prison into a fortress. Poiret, one of the warders, horrified by what had already been done, was the leader in the resolution, in which he was joined by the Abbé Lamazan, who called out, "Don't let us be shot, my friends. Let us defend ourselves. Trust in God, he is on our side." The sergents de ville, captives in the story below, had made the same resolution. They had no arms, but they barricaded the doors, and resolved to defend themselves from the murderous throng outside, howling for their blood. 2 guns and a mortar had been brought by the mob to fire on the prison, and the moment was critical. Suddenly there came a lull in the uproar. Something had taken place. In a few minutes more the crowd broke up and dispersed, dragging away the guns they had brought. Word had reached them that the council had fled from its headquarters to Belleville, and a sudden panic seized the mob. Yet that night they returned, howling and cursing, while a barricade near by was still held by the insurgents. But with the early dawn this was abandoned, the mob melted away, and soon after a battalion of rescuers marched up and took possession of the prison. The captives were saved. Their resistance, seemingly so desperate, had proved successful. That day, Sunday, May 28th, ended the rule of the Commune. The Versailles troops, who had been fighting their way steadily from street to street since the 21st, completed their work. The whole great city was in their hands, and the rule of the Commune was over. The Commune had left devastation behind it. On every side were smouldering ruins, including the great municipal buildings, the law courts, and other public edifices, 2 theatres, 8 whole streets, and innumerable private houses, while the dead bodies of its victims lay where they had been shot down. The soldiers, infuriated by the ruin which they beheld on all sides, were savage in their revenge. Every man seized whose hands were black with powder was instantly shot, many innocent persons perishing, since numbers had been forced to the barricades. The story of what took place during those bloody days of retribution is too long to tell, and it must suffice to sum it up in the frightful death roll of 14,000 persons, 6,000 of them killed in open fight, 8,000 executed in bitter revenge. The executions over, the prisons were filled to bursting. Count Orsi tells us that 600 men were locked up in the wine cellars of Versailles, 45 feet underground. He himself, falsely seized through the malice of an enemy, spent 10 days in this horrible place amid the scum of the insurgents. As for the members of the Council of the Commune, some escaped, some were executed, others were transported to New Caledonia, a lonely isle in the far Pacific, from which they were subsequently freed when the hot blood of that year of revengeful retribution cooled down. Thus ends the remarkable story of that year of war, insurrection, and devastation, the whole due to the overweening ambition of one man, Louis Napoleon, who wished to shine as a great conqueror. The destiny of France lay in his hand alone. He blindly decided upon war. The result was the humiliation of France, the death of thousands of her sons, the overthrow of her government, the frightful saturnalia of the rule of the Commune, and the loss to France of 2 of her provinces, those of Alsace and Lorraine, and a war indemnity of $1,000,000,000. Such terrors march in the train of blind and unrestrained ambition. The End. End of chapter 32. End of Historical Tales, Volume 6, French, by Charles Morris.